I was on a stretcher, being wheeled into the operating room for a life-altering surgery, when my husband ran up to the doctors and begged them to stop. I thought he wanted to pray for me. I thought he wanted to tell me he loved me one last time. Instead, he leaned over my trembling body and whispered, "The pins you gave me for your bank accounts are wrong. If you die in there, I can't get to the money before the banks do." In that moment, I didn't see my husband. I saw a vulture waiting for my heart to stop. Now, I've survived the surgery, but my marriage is in the ICU. He says he was just being practical for our children. My family says he was waiting for me to die. Should I forgive a man who was counting my cash while I was counting my breaths? Does "till death do us part" mean waiting for the death to happen? If you think he's a predator, hit the like button. I need the jury to weigh in on this. Subscribe for the full story of how I escaped the man who wanted my pin more than my pulse. Share this and ask, is this planning or is it predatory? Here is the story of my surgery from hell. The kitchen was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic thump-thump of the laundry dryer in the next room. It was a normal Tuesday, the kind of day that usually felt safe, grounded in the mundane, responsible tasks of a mother and wife. I was at the table, a stack of bills on my left and a pen in my hand. I had already prepaid the children's school fees for the next 2 terms. I had stocked the pantry with enough dry goods to last a month. I had even written out the schedule for the kids' lessons and snacks on a whiteboard on the fridge. I was preparing for my surgery the way I prepared for everything else in our marriage, by carrying the world on my shoulders so it wouldn't crush anyone else. David walked in, his footsteps heavy on the linoleum. He didn't come to me to rub my shoulders. He didn't ask if I was scared about the procedure. He pulled out the chair opposite me, the screech of the wood against the floor sounding like a warning I didn't yet know how to read. He sat down, his hands folded on the table. He looked at me with a cold, clinical intensity that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Martha," he started, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth a husband should have for a wife facing the knife. "We need to talk about the accounts." "The accounts?" I asked, looking up from the school fee receipts. "I told you I've handled everything. The rent is set. The kids are taken care of." "No," he interrupted, his eyes locking onto mine. "I mean your private savings. The money you keep in the bank. I need your pins." I froze. A small, nervous laugh escaped my lips because I genuinely thought it was a joke. "My pins? David, why would you need my pins? I'm coming back in 3 days." He didn't laugh back. He didn't even blink. "Surgery is 50-50, Martha. That's just the math. If the unwanted happens, if you don't come out of that theater, do you have any idea what happens to that money? The banks eat it. They tie it up in probate for years. The looters at the top will step on your hard-earned cash while our children go without." The room felt like it had suddenly lost all its oxygen. I looked at the man I had been married to for years, the man I had 2 children with, and I didn't recognize him. He wasn't talking to his partner. He was talking to a life insurance policy he was afraid of losing. "You're talking about me like I'm already gone," I whispered. My voice felt small, like a flickering candle in a cold wind. "Don't you wish for me to come out alive? Don't you believe the doctors?" "I'm being practical," he said, leaning in. "I'm not going to spend it on myself. I'll give it to the children. Isn't it better your children have that money than the bank? Just give me the numbers. It's for their security." The responsible part of me, the part that had spent a decade making sure everyone else was safe, tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just scared. Maybe this was his twisted way of showing concern for the kids. But the reckless instinct, the one buried deep in my gut, told me something else. It told me that he wasn't securing the kids' future. He was settling my estate before my body was even cold. "I'll think about it," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Don't think too long," he replied, standing up and heading toward the door. "The clock is ticking." I sat there in the silence, staring at the receipts. For the first time, the surgery didn't scare me. The man in the other room did. I picked up my pen, but instead of writing a check, I started talking to God in the silence of my heart. "Lord, let me come back alive. Not for the money, but because I'm starting to think I'm the only one truly standing between my children and a vulture. I reached for a scrap of paper and wrote down 4 digits. They weren't my PIN. They were a lie. A fake sequence to buy me enough peace to make it to the hospital. Because in that moment, I realized my surgery wasn't just 50-50. My marriage was 0 out of 100, and I was the only one left fighting for my life. The days leading up to the procedure felt like walking through a thick, suffocating fog. Every time I looked at David, I didn't see the man who had stood beside me at our wedding. I saw a man who was already mentally counting the inheritance. The fake pin I had scribbled on that piece of paper sat on the kitchen counter like a ticking time bomb. I watched him tuck it into his wallet with a satisfied nod, never once pausing to ask if I needed a glass of water, a prayer, or even a simple hug. I was nervous. I was disturbed. My mind was a whirlwind of dark thoughts. I began to wonder, if I don't make it, will he even cry at the funeral? Or will he be at the ATM before the service starts? When I finally checked into the hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic and the bright, unforgiving fluorescent lights felt strangely honest compared to the atmosphere at home. Here, at least, the stakes were clear. I was draped in a thin hospital gown, sitting on the edge of the crinkly paper-covered bed, when my surgeon, Dr. Aris, walked in. Dr. Aris had been my doctor for years. He knew me. He knew I was the responsible one. The woman who usually walked into his office with a notepad, a list of questions, and a steady hand. But today, he stopped in the doorway, his brow furrowed as he looked at the vitals monitor. "Martha," he said softly, pulling a rolling stool toward the bed. "Your blood pressure is skyrocketing. This isn't like you. You've always been the courageous one. Talk to me. Is it the procedure? Are you worried about the anesthesia?" I tried to keep the mask on. I tried to give him the responsible smile. "I'm just a little tired, doctor. It's been a long week." He didn't buy it. He reached out and placed a hand on mine, his eyes searching mine. "It's more than that. You're not just nervous. You're terrified. And it's not the theater you're afraid of." What happened? The dam finally broke. I couldn't hold it in any longer. The words tumbled out of me, jagged and raw. I told him about the kitchen table conversation. I told him about the 50/50ths math. I told him how my husband had spent my final night at home asking for the keys to my bank accounts instead of the keys to my heart. Dr. Aris's face transformed. The professional, calm demeanor was replaced by a look. "Who does that?" he asked, his voice low and sharp. "Who asks their wife for her pins while she's preparing for surgery? That isn't prudence, Martha. That is selfish. That is unkind. It is predatory to put that kind of emotional weight on a patient right before we open them up." I felt a wave of relief wash over me just hearing a professional validate my horror. For days, David had made me feel like I was the one being emotional, like I was the one who didn't understand business. But Dr. Aris saw it for what it was, a betrayal. "Listen to me," Dr. Aris said, leaning in. "Do you believe in God?" "Very much," I whispered. "Then believe this. I am going to take care of you. We are going into that theater, and we are going to fix what's wrong. You are coming back. You are going to see your children grow up. Do not give that man another second of your fear. He doesn't hold your life. God does, and my team does." For the first time in a week, I felt like I could take a full breath. The responsible Martha began to stand back up. I realized that the hospital was the safest place I had been in months, because it was the only place where people actually wanted me to stay alive. But outside the room, in the waiting area, David was sitting there, checking his phone, waiting for the unwanted to happen so he could see if those numbers I gave him would finally clear the screen. He didn't know that the doctor he was about to shake hands with was already looking at him like a monster. As the nurse came in with the sedative, I felt a strange peace. I wasn't just going into surgery to save my body. I was going in to find the strength to leave the man who had already buried me in his mind. The sedative was supposed to make me drowsy. It was supposed to wrap my mind in a thick, velvety blanket of indifference so that the transition from the pre-op room to the operating theater would feel like a dream. But the trauma of the last few days acted like a stimulant, fighting against the medication. I lay on the stretcher, my head propped up by a thin, flat pillow, watching the acoustic tiles of the hospital ceiling zip past like white clouds in a sterile sky. The two health workers pushing me were young, their movements practiced and efficient. I could hear the rhythmic squeak-squeak of the stretcher's rubber wheels against the highly polished linoleum. It was the sound of a conveyor belt. I felt like an object being moved from one station to the next. I stared at the 4 bags swaying on the pole above me, the clear fluid dripping steadily. 1 drop, 2 drops. Life being measured out in milliliters. I was trying to do what Dr. Eris told me. I was trying to talk to God. Please, I whispered in the hollows of my mind. Don't let this be the end. Not like this. Not with my heart full of this much poison. We were approaching the double steel doors of the surgical wing, the point of no return. This was where the families usually stood, offering a final kiss, a desperate squeeze of the hand, or a whispered "I love you" that had to last for the hours of silence to come. Suddenly, the stretcher jerked to a halt. Wait! Stop! I need to talk to her. The voice was unmistakable. It wasn't the calm, pastoral tone David used when he wanted to sound like a leader. It was high-pitched, frantic, and jagged. I turned my head slowly, the sedative making the movement feel like I was underwater. David was running down the hallway toward us. He looked disheveled. His shirt was untucked at the side, and a thin sheen of sweat covered his forehead. For a split second, a tiny, foolish fraction of a second, my responsible heart leaped. He's realized it, I thought. He's realized he's been a monster. He's coming to tell me he's sorry. He's coming to say that the money doesn't matter, that only I matter. The two health workers looked at each other, then back at the man charging toward them. They were trained for medical emergencies, not emotional ones. They stepped aside, giving him space, their faces etched with a wary respect for what they assumed was a husband's final goodbye. David reached the side of the stretcher. He was panting, his breath hot and smelling of the coffee he'd been drinking while waiting for me to be wheeled away. He didn't reach for my hand. He didn't lean down to kiss my forehead. He gripped the cold metal railing of the stretcher so hard his knuckles turned white. He leaned down, his face just inches from mine. I could see the frantic movement of his pupils, darting back and forth as if he were looking for a lost key. "Martha," he hissed, his voice a low, urgent vibration. "The pins. The ones you wrote down on the counter." My heart, already stressed by the upcoming surgery, gave a violent thud against my ribs. "David, please, not now. Listen to me," he snapped, ignoring my plea. The two workers moved uncomfortably, sensing the shift in the air, but David didn't care. I went to the branch. I tried the numbers. They're wrong. The machine blocked me after the second attempt. "I told you surgery is 50-50. If the looters get in there and freeze the accounts, the kids get nothing. You have to give me the right sequence. Right now. Before they take you behind those doors." I felt a coldness wash over me that was deeper than any surgical chill. It was the absolute, crushing realization that I was married to a vulture. He wasn't sweating because he was afraid I would die. He was sweating because he was afraid he'd be locked out of my bank account. He had spent the last hour, while I was being prepped, while I was being stuck with needles, while I was praying for my life, at an ATM trying to see if he could withdraw the future I had built. "You went to the bank?" I whispered, tears finally stinging my eyes. "While I was in pre-op. You left the hospital to go to the bank?" "I'm trying to secure the future," he justified, his voice rising, drawing the attention of a nurse at the nearby station. "Why are you being so difficult? Just tell me the 4 numbers. It's for the kids, Martha. Don't let the banks win." The sedation was stripped away by a surge of pure, primal adrenaline. The responsible wife who paid the feeding, the school fees, the snacks, and the clothing, the woman who had carried him for a decade, finally broke. "Get away from me!" I screamed. The sound echoed through the sterile corridor like a physical blow. The health workers jumped back. The double doors of the surgical theater opened, and Dr. Eris stepped out, already masked and gloved, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. "I hope I won't die like this," I shrieked, my body trembling on the stretcher. He's waiting for my heart to stop. He's waiting for the money. Get him away from me. I'm scared. I'm getting scared. David's face turned a deep, bruised purple. He realized he had lost control of the narrative. He looked at the doctors and nurses who were now surrounding us, their faces filled with a mixture of professional shock and human disgust. "She's hysterical," David shouted, his hands raised in a defensive gesture. "She's the one who gave me the wrong numbers. I was just trying to be prudent." "Security." Dr. Eris's voice cut through the chaos like a scalpel. He didn't look at David. He looked at the nurses. "Get this man out of this wing. Now. And call the police. I want him off the premises immediately." "You can't do that," David yelled as two large security. "You have the right to remain silent," the younger guard said, grabbing David by the arm. I watched through a blur of tears as they dragged him away. He was still shouting about the looters, still shouting about the 50/50th chance. But his voice grew fainter and fainter as they pulled him toward the elevators. I lay there, gasping for air, my chest heaving. My blood pressure monitor was screaming, a high-pitched beep 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 that signaled my body was in a state of total crisis. I felt a hand on mine. It was Dr. Eris. He had pulled off his mask, and his face was a mask of steady, calm resolve. "Breathe with me, Martha," he said. "Just breathe. He's gone. He can't get to you. He can't get to your money, and he can't get to your peace." "I don't want to die," I sobbed. "I don't want to die and leave my kids with a man like that." "Then don't," the doctor said. "We're going to go in there and we're going to do this perfectly. You have a reason to fight now, don't you?" The nurses began to move again, pushing the stretcher through the double doors. As the doors swung shut behind us, I felt the world of David fall away. I was in a world of blue scrubs, bright lights, and people who saw me as a human being worth saving, not a pin code. The transition was fast. They moved me onto the narrow operating table. The room was cold, filled with the hum of machines and the clink of metal instruments. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I was angry, and as the anesthesiologist leaned over me, I realized that anger was a much better fuel for survival than fear ever was. "We're going to play your favorite songs, Martha," a nurse whispered, placing a soft mask over my face. "What do you want to hear?" "Anything loud," I whispered back. "Anything that sounds like life." As the darkness started to pull at the edges of my vision, the first notes of a song began to play. I didn't think about the 50/50 chance. I thought about the 100% chance that I was going to wake up and start a life where my heart belonged to me and my money belonged to my children. I opened my eyes, and the world was a blur of white and chrome. My throat felt like I had swallowed hot coals, and a dull, pulsing ache radiated from my midsection. But as I drew my first conscious breath, I felt a lightness that had nothing to do with the painkillers. The weight of the vulture was gone. I was in the recovery room. A nurse noticed my eyes fluttering and stepped into my line of sight, her smile gentle. "Welcome back, Martha. You did wonderfully. Dr. Eris is just finishing up some paperwork, but he'll be in to see you shortly." I tried to speak, but only a dry rasp came out. She held a cup with a straw to my lips, and the cold water felt like a miracle. As the fog cleared, the memories of the hallway, the sweat on David's face, the desperation in his voice, the way he had tried to hijack my journey to the operating table, came rushing back. I closed my eyes, and a single tear escaped, hot and bitter. An hour later, Dr. Eris walked in. He looked tired, his surgical cap tucked into his pocket. But when he saw me, his expression softened into one of genuine relief. He pulled up the same rolling stool and sat beside me. "You're a fighter, Martha," he said, checking my vitals. "Your blood pressure spiked dangerously right before we went under. But once we got started, you settled beautifully. You're clean, you're stable, and you're going to be just fine." "Thank you," I whispered, my voice finally returning. He stayed silent for a moment, his gaze shifting to the door before looking back at me. "Martha, I need to talk to you not as a doctor, but as a human being. We had to have security stay at the entrance of the wing during your entire procedure. Your husband, he didn't just leave quietly. He tried to come back 3 times. He told the front desk he had urgent financial matters to discuss with you before you were incapacitated. The chill returned. Even while I was unconscious, with my life in the hands of strangers, David was still circling, looking for a way to pick the locks of my life. He's a desperate man, Martha, Dr. Aris continued, his voice dropping to a low, serious tone. In my experience, desperation like that is dangerous. He wasn't worried about you. He was worried about the access he was losing. I've already made a note in your chart that he is not allowed in this room. But you need to think about what happens when you leave this hospital. I can't go back, I said. The realization hit me with the force of a tidal wave. I pay for everything, doctor. The food, the clothes, the school fees. I've been the one holding the roof up, and he was just waiting for me to fall, so he could catch the coins that dropped from my pockets. I agree, Dr. Aris said firmly. I've seen this pattern before. A man who shows his hand like that at your most vulnerable moment isn't going to change when you're healthy. He's going to escalate because he knows he's lost his grip on you. My suggestion, when you are discharged, do not go to your house. Do not give him the chance to corner you while you are still healing. Go to your family. Go somewhere he cannot manipulate you. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, thinking about my 2 children. They were at home with a man who was probably currently searching the house for my spare checkbooks or bank statements. The responsible Martha, the one who wanted to keep the peace, the one who wanted to believe in the sanctity of marriage, was dead. She had died on that stretcher. The woman who remained was a survivor. I'll call my brothers, I said. Good, the doctor replied. We'll keep you here for a few days to make sure the healing is well underway. Use that time. Change your passwords. Call your bank. And Martha, don't look back. A man who counts your money while you're counting your breaths doesn't deserve to count your days with you. I spent that evening in the quiet of the recovery ward, my phone in my hand. I didn't call David. I didn't read his frantic, manipulative texts about how he was just trying to protect the children from the bank looters. Instead, I called my brother, Samuel. When I told him what happened, when I described David stopping the stretcher to demand the correct pins, the silence on the other end of the line was terrifying. Samuel is a man of few words, but I could hear his breathing turn heavy with a protective, brotherly rage. Don't say another word to him, Martha, Samuel said. We're coming to get you. When the doctors say you can leave, you're coming to the house. We'll get the kids. We'll get your things. It's over. A man who treats his wife like a dying ATM doesn't get to be a husband anymore. As I hung up, I looked at the surgical site under the bandages. It was a scar I would carry forever, but it wasn't a mark of shame. It was a mark of the day I found out exactly what I was worth, and realized that the man I loved thought the answer was a 4-digit number. I was alive. I was clean. And for the first time in 10 years, I was truly free. The discharge day arrived with a crisp, biting clarity. I was sitting in a wheelchair, my bag packed, feeling the pull of the stitches in my abdomen. A constant, physical reminder to move slowly, to breathe deeply, and to protect myself. Samuel and my younger brother, Joseph, were already there. They stood by the door like twin pillars of granite. They didn't speak much, but the way they looked at the hallway, scanning every... Are you ready, Martha? Samuel asked, his voice low and steady. I'm ready, I said, but as we moved toward the elevators, my heart began that familiar, frantic dance. I knew David. He wasn't the type to go down quietly. He lived for the narrative. He lived for the version of the story where he was the victim of a grand misunderstanding. We reached the lobby, and the automatic doors slid open to a wall of humidity and noise. And there he was. David was standing by the fountain, holding a bouquet of wilted grocery store roses. He looked pathetic. His eyes were red-rimmed, his hair uncombed, and he was wearing the same shirt from the day of the surgery. It was a calculated look. He wanted to look like a man who had spent 3 days in a state of prayerful mourning. Martha! he cried out, moving toward us. Thank God. I've been calling the desk every hour. They wouldn't let me up. They told me I was a threat to my own wife. Samuel stepped forward, his massive frame blocking David's path. That's because you are David. Step back. This is between me and my wife, Sam, David shouted, his voice cracking with artificial emotion. Martha, tell them I was just scared. I heard a story about a woman whose family lost their home because she died without a will, and the banks took everything. I was just trying to make sure our children were safe. I was desperate. Who wouldn't be desperate when their wife is 50-50? I looked at him, really looked at him. For the first time since the theater scream, I didn't see a husband. I didn't even see a man. I saw a hollow shell of Prudence that was actually just greed disguised as fatherly concern. You went to the ATM, David? I said, my voice cold and clear, echoing across the hospital lobby. While I was being prepped for surgery, while the nurses were sticking me with needles, you weren't in the chapel. You were at the branch testing the fake numbers I gave you. You didn't come to the stretcher to say goodbye. You came because the transaction failed. A few people in the lobby stopped to look. The responsible Martha would have been mortified by the scene. She would have whispered to keep the peace. But that Martha had died under the anesthesia. I was securing the funds, David pleaded, his face twisting into a mask of righteous indignation. I pay the rent, Martha. I keep the roof over your head. I have a right to know how we're going to survive if you don't make it. You pay $400K for rent, Joseph chimed in, his voice dripping with disdain. And Martha pays for everything else. She pays for the food you eat, the clothes on your back, and the school fees for the children you claim to be protecting. You aren't a provider, David. You're a tenant who wanted a promotion to landlord the second she closed her eyes. You're all overreacting, David screamed. The man of God, facade finally shattering. The roses fell to the floor, forgotten. You're misquoting me. You're turning a moment of panic into a crime. I love my wife. I was just being smart. Smart people go to lawyers, David, I said, leaning forward in my wheelchair. Predators go to stretchers. You showed me exactly who you are when you thought I couldn't fight back. Well, I'm back. And I'm taking my children. I'm taking my money. And I'm taking my life. You can't leave me, he hissed, his eyes darting toward the security guards who were now approaching. I'll tell the kids you abandoned the family. I'll tell the church you've lost your mind from the medication. Tell them whatever you want, I said, signaling Samuel to start moving the wheelchair. But do it from the house you pay rent for. Because I won't be there to pay for the lights anymore. As we rolled toward the car, David was left standing in the lobby, shouting at our retreating backs. He looked small. He looked like the looter he was so afraid of. When Samuel helped me into the passenger seat and pulled away from the curb, I looked at the hospital in the rearview mirror. I thought about the 50-50th chance. David was right, surgery is a gamble. But the real gamble wasn't the surgery. The real gamble was staying with a man who was already spending my ghost's money. I looked at my brothers. Let's go get my kids. The first night at my brother's house was the quietest night of my life, yet I couldn't sleep. I lay in the guest room, the scent of lavender and old wood a sharp contrast to the antiseptic air of the hospital. My children were sleeping in the room next to me, safe, though confused about why Dad wasn't here. I stared at the ceiling, my stitches throbbing with every heartbeat. I thought the battle was over when I left the hospital lobby. I was wrong. By 2 a.m., my phone began to glow in the dark like a radioactive coal. David wasn't calling me. He knew I wouldn't answer. He was doing something much more calculated. He was posting. I watched, paralyzed, as the man of God persona I had helped him build for 10 years was weaponized against me. He posted a photo of himself sitting alone in our living room, the lights dimmed, holding a family portrait. I ask for your prayers tonight, the caption read. My beloved Martha has undergone a successful surgery, but the physical trauma has triggered a deep, spiritual confusion. She is being influenced by those who seek to divide what God has joined. She has misinterpreted a moment of my fatherly concern for our children's future as something dark. My heart is broken, not just for my marriage, but for a wife who no longer recognizes the man who has provided for her for a decade. Please, pray for her clarity. The responsible Martha felt a familiar surge of panic. My first instinct was to call him, to explain, to beg him to take it down. I could see the comments pouring in, praying for Martha's healing mind. And the enemy loves to attack during illness. He was gaslighting an entire community. He was turning my survival into a mental breakdown and his greed into fatherly concern. "Don't look at it," Samuel said, standing in the doorway. He had seen the blue light of the phone from the hall. "He's trying to lure you back into the cage by making you feel like the villain. But remember the stretcher, Martha. Remember the sweat on his face when he told you the pins were wrong. That wasn't spiritual confusion. That was a heist." I put the phone face down. Samuel was right. David was playing a game of shadows, but I was the only one who had seen what he looked like in the light of the operating room. The next morning, the prudent man narrative began to crumble. I spent the morning on the phone with my bank. I found out that while I was in the recovery room, David hadn't just tried the ATM twice. He had tried to call the fraud department, pretending to be me, claiming I had forgotten my security questions and needed a temporary password reset. He wasn't just securing the kids' future. He was trying to drain the accounts before I woke up. I sat at my brother's kitchen table, looking at the logs the bank manager had sent over. The responsible wife, who had paid every snack and every lesson for 10 years, finally understood the truth. I hadn't been married to a partner. I had been married to a parasite who had grown so large he thought he owned the host. "I'm filing for an emergency injunction," I told Samuel. "And I'm going to the church board. If he wants..." I realized then that the most responsible thing I could do wasn't to keep the peace. It was to burn the bridge so thoroughly that he could never cross it again. The 50-50 chance was over. I was betting 100% on myself. The church community hall was filled with the smell of stale coffee and the heavy, judgmental silence of people who believed they were witnessing a tragedy. I stood at the back of the room, my hand pressed against my side to steady the dull ache of my incision. I was still weak, still healing, but I had refused to let my brother speak for me. If I was going to be the villain in David's story, I was going to be a villain who looked him in the eye. David was already at the front of the room, surrounded by 3 of the church elders. He was leaning against a table, his shoulders slumped in a posture of perfect, practiced grief. He was mid-sentence, his voice projecting that soulful, resonant tone he used for funerals. "And I just want what's best for the kids, elders," David said, dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief. "Martha is... she's not herself. The anesthesia, the stress of the bills, it's made her paranoid. She thinks I was trying to steal from her. Me, the man who has paid the rent for 10 years? I was just trying to protect our legacy." The elders nodded, their faces grim. One of them, a man named Elder Thompson, looked up and saw me. The room went cold. "Martha," Thompson said, his voice cautious. "We were just hearing David's side of things. He's very concerned about your emotional state." I walked forward, every step a calculated defiance of the pain in my body. I didn't look at the elders. I looked at David. I watched the way his eyes darted toward my purse, probably wondering if the bank statements were inside. "I'm sure he is concerned," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a cold snap. "But David's concern has a price tag, and I've finally stopped paying it." "Martha, honey," David started, stepping toward me with his arms open. "You shouldn't be out of bed. You're confused." "I'm not confused, David. I'm awake. For the first time in 10 years, I am wide awake." I turned to the elders. "David told you he was being prudent. He told you he was protecting the children's future. But did he tell you that while I was on the stretcher, he stopped the nurses? Did he tell you that he didn't ask the doctor if I was going to live, but instead complained that my bank pins weren't working?" The elders looked uncomfortable. "Well," Thompson stammered, He mentioned a disagreement about the accounts. But in a time of crisis, people get frantic. Frantic. I laughed, and it was a sound of pure, jagged irony. He wasn't frantic for me. He was frantic for the balance. While I was under the knife, he wasn't in the waiting room praying. I have the bank logs right here. I pulled a stack of papers from my bag and laid them on the table with a definitive thwack. These are the timestamps, I said, pointing to the highlighted lines. While the surgeons were opening my chest, David was calling the bank's fraud line 3 towns away. He tried to reset my security questions. He tried to transfer my personal savings into an account I don't have access to. He told the bank representative that I was terminally ill and had given him power of attorney. He wasn't preparing for my death, elders. He was auditioning for the role of my widower while I was still warm on the table. The room went deathly silent. David's face went from grieving husband to cornered predator in a heartbeat. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him a sickly, ashen gray. That's for the kids," David shouted, his voice cracking. "If you died, the state would take it. I was protecting them. The kids." I stepped closer to him. "The kids whose school fees I pay? The kids whose food and clothes I provide while you handle the big responsibility of the rent? You aren't protecting them from the bank, David. You're protecting your lifestyle from the possibility of me leaving. You knew that if I lived, I would eventually realize I didn't need you. So you tried to make sure that even if I lived, I'd be broke and beholden to you." Elder Thompson picked up the bank logs, his eyes scanning the timestamps. He looked at David, then back at the papers. The responsible man narrative was evaporating. "David," Thompson said, his voice dropping an octave, "you told us you were at the hospital the whole time." I had to step out for air," David stammered. "I was stressed. I wasn't thinking straight." "No," I said, my voice steady and final. "You were thinking very straight. You were thinking about the 50/50th chance. You were betting on the 50 that ended with me in a box and you in a beach house. But I'm the 50 that survived. And I'm the 50 that's done." I turned back to the elders. "I'm not here to ask for the church to fix my marriage. You can't fix something that was actually a transaction. I'm here to tell you that the locks on the house have been changed. The accounts are frozen. And the man of God you've been holding up as a pillar is actually a vulture who doesn't even know his own wife's middle name, but knows exactly how many zeros are in her savings account." I walked out of the hall. I didn't wait for David to shout. I didn't wait for the elders to deliberate. As I stepped into the sunlight, I felt the stitches pull one last time. It was a sharp pain, but it felt like a healing. I got into Samuel's car. I looked at my phone. David was already blocked. The responsible Martha was gone, and the free Martha was finally heading home. The transition from the family home to my brother's spare room was supposed to be temporary, but as the days turned into weeks, the thought of returning to that house felt like walking back into a crime scene. I had sent Samuel and Joseph to collect the rest of my things. I couldn't do it. I couldn't stand in that kitchen where the 50/50 conversation happened. I couldn't look at the bed where I had lain awake, terrified of the surgery, while the man beside me was likely dreaming of ledger entries. When my brothers returned with the final boxes, they dropped them in the middle of the room with a heavy, final thud. "He was there," Samuel said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "He sat on the porch the whole time we packed. He didn't yell. He didn't fight. He just kept saying, 'She'll be back.' When the money runs low and the reality of being a single mother hits her, she'll be back." I felt a surge of that old, responsible fear. David knew my pressure points. He knew I had spent a decade worrying about every cent, every school fee, every lesson. He was banking on my exhaustion. He was waiting for the weight of the world to crush me so I would crawl back to the safety of the roof he provided. But then Joseph handed me a small, crumpled envelope. "Found this tucked in the back of your jewelry box. It was under the velvet lining. Looks like he missed it." I opened it. Inside were 3 bank slips I didn't recognize. They weren't mine. I looked at the names on the accounts, shell names, linked to a post office box in a neighboring county. I began to cross-reference the dates with our household expenses. For years, whenever the children needed new shoes or I mentioned the rising cost of groceries, David would sigh and talk about how tight things were. He would lecture me on. Meanwhile, these slips showed steady, monthly deposits of $150K, the exact amount I thought he was struggling to contribute to the household. The responsible wife felt a cold, hard clarity settle in her chest. He hadn't just been waiting for me to die. He had been stealing from the living. He was hoarding a freedom fund, while I was skipping meals to make sure the kids had music lessons. He wasn't a panicked father. He was a strategist. I sat on the floor, surrounded by the boxes of my life, and I didn't cry. I started a spreadsheet. By that evening, I had mapped out the last 5 years of our marriage. I realized that the $400K rent he paid was the only thing he paid, and even that was likely coming from a surplus he had hidden away. He had treated our marriage like a business where he was the CEO and I was the unpaid, disposable labor. I picked up my phone and called my lawyer. "I have more than a pin story now," I said. "I have the receipts of a decade-long fraud. I don't just want a divorce. I want an audit." As I hung up, I looked at my children playing in the yard through the window. They looked lighter. They didn't have to walk on eggshells around a man whose mood shifted with the stock market. I realized then that the responsible thing to do wasn't to save the marriage. It was to dismantle the lie so completely that he could never use it to lure another woman into his 50-50 trap. David thought I would come back when I got tired. He didn't realize that I had been tired for 10 years, and this fight for the truth was the most energized I had ever been. The transition from the family home to my brother's spare room was supposed to be temporary, but as the days turned into weeks, the thought of returning to that house felt like walking back into a crime scene. I had sent Samuel and Joseph to collect the rest of my things. I couldn't do it. I couldn't stand in that kitchen where the 50-50 conversation happened. I couldn't look at the bed where I had lain awake, terrified of the surgery, while the man beside me was likely dreaming of ledger entries. When my brothers returned with the final boxes, they dropped them in the middle of the room with a heavy, final thud. "He was there," Samuel said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "He sat on the porch the whole time we packed. He didn't yell. He didn't fight. He just kept saying, 'She'll be back.' When the money runs low and the reality of being a single mother hits her, she'll be back." I felt a surge of that old, responsible fear. David knew my pressure points. He knew I had spent a decade worrying about every cent, every school fee, every lesson. He was banking on my exhaustion. He was waiting for the weight of the world to crush me so I would crawl back to the safety of the roof he provided. But then Joseph handed me a small, crumpled envelope. "Found this tucked in the back of your jewelry box. It was under the velvet lining. Looks like he missed it." I opened it. Inside were 3 bank slips I didn't recognize. They weren't mine. I looked at the names on the accounts, shell names, linked to a post office box in a neighboring county. I began to cross-reference the dates with our household expenses. For years, whenever the children needed new shoes or I mentioned the rising cost of groceries, David would sigh and talk about how tight things were. He would lecture me on frugality and spiritual discipline regarding our finances. Meanwhile, these slips showed steady, monthly deposits of $150K, the exact amount I thought he was struggling to contribute to the household. The responsible wife felt a cold, hard clarity settle in her chest. He hadn't just been waiting for me to die. He had been stealing from the living. He was hoarding a freedom fund, while I was skipping meals to make sure the kids had music lessons. He wasn't a panicked father. He was a strategist. I sat on the floor, surrounded by the boxes of my life, and I didn't cry. I started a spreadsheet. By that evening, I had mapped out the last 5 years of our marriage. I realized that the $400K rent he paid was the only thing he paid, and even that was likely coming from a surplus he had hidden away. He had treated our marriage like a business where he was the CEO and I was the unpaid, disposable labor. I picked up my phone and called my lawyer. "I have more than a pin story now," I said. "I have the receipts of a decade-long fraud. I don't just want a divorce. I want an audit." As I hung up, I looked at my children playing in the yard through the window. They looked lighter. They didn't have to walk on eggshells around a man whose mood shifted with the stock market. I realized then that the responsible thing to do wasn't to save the marriage. It was to dismantle the lie so completely that he could never use it to lure another woman into his 50-50 trap. David thought I would come back when I got tired. He didn't realize that I had been tired for 10 years, and this fight for the truth was the most energized I had ever been. The house no longer smells like peppermint and cold calculation. It smells like the orange-scented cleaner I used to scrub the floors and the fresh air that now circulates through every room. The silence isn't heavy anymore. It's light. It's the kind of silence that allows you to hear your own thoughts for the first time in a decade. The trial ended not with a bang, but with a series of signatures. David, faced with the evidence of his fraud and the recorded testimony of the medical staff, took a settlement that stripped him of his provider status once and for all. He walked away with the clothes he bought with his hidden money and a reputation that was as shredded as my old medical gown. I am sitting at my kitchen table now, the same table where David once sat and told me that my life was a coin toss. I am looking at a new bank statement. It's not as large as the one David tried to steal, because I've spent a lot on legal fees and the cost of rebuilding. But every single kobo on that page is honest. Every digit is a testament to a woman who decided she was worth more than a 50-50th chance. My children are in the living room, building a fortress out of pillows. They don't have to whisper anymore. They don't have to check Dad's mood before they laugh. They are learning that a home is built on trust, not on prudence that hides a predatory heart. I am the narrator of this story, but you have been the jury through every chapter. I lived through the 50-50ths math. I lived through the stretcher showdown. I lived through the gaslighting and the financial war. And as I stand here today, I realize that the surgery didn't just save my body. It saved my soul from a man who was counting my cash while I was counting my breaths. So, I bring this final case to you, the jury of the internet. David is still out there. He's telling anyone who will listen that I robbed him of his family. He says that in a moment of crisis, a man is allowed to be practically minded. He says that I used a few minutes of his panic to destroy a 10-year marriage and take his children. Did I do the right thing by exposing the fraud and cutting him out completely? Is there any context that excuses a man trying to drain his wife's bank account while she is under? Or did I go too far? Should I have allowed him to stay in the children's lives? Was his greed actually just a twisted, broken form of fear that could have been healed with counseling and time? Did I looted the marriage by refusing to forgive a man who was clearly at his lowest point? Cast your final vote. I'm reading every comment. I'm looking at every verdict. Because while my surgery is healed, the scars on my heart are still being written. What would you do if the person who promised to love and cherish you was waiting for your pin instead of your pulse? The jury is in session. The final word is yours.